Well, this past week I was thinking about the youth a lot and thinking about this service, and I began to do some work, just some research to kind of look at youth and where they are and how they think and all those kinds of things. I know that's a $64,000 question, how they think, but I began to really look at it, and I realized that most of our youth today were born after 1992, around that time, and I came to pastor this church in 1990. That means I've been pastoring this church longer than some of these kids have been alive, and that's kind of a humbling thought right off the bat. But I realized some things have really changed across those years since 1990, 91, 92. For example, to them, to the youth, Fergie is a pop singer, not a princess. That's all they've ever known. They have never twisted the coiled wrist wire or the wire on a phone aimlessly around their wrist while talking on the telephone. They've never had that joy of twisting that cord around their hands. They've never realized that pointing to your hand like this means, what time is it? They just don't think like that. For their generation, as long as they've been alive, Czechoslovakia has never existed. I found that one kind of interesting. They've never seen a Kodachrome slide projector or slides unless they found it in their grandparents' closet. They just don't know what that is. Toothpaste tubes have always been made to stand up on their end. That's the way that they've been raised. And J.R. Ewing has always been dead, as far as they're concerned. So that was something about youth. Well, today is Youth Sunday, obviously. And I'm grateful for our youth ministry at Mount Harmony Baptist Church. I'm very grateful for all of our youth. And 2 weeks ago, Dr. Alex McFarland was here from Southern Evangelical Seminary. And between services, he went to the youth Sunday school class. And when he came to the 1045 service, if you were in that service, he paid a great compliment to our youth. He said that he had gone to that Sunday school class, and it was one of the greatest youth Sunday school classes he had been in a long, long, long time. Now, we knew that. We knew we had a great youth group and great youth teaching here. But to hear it from somebody else is really, really significant. That's very, very important. Now, as I thought about this Youth Sunday, I began to think, what can I say to these young people and about these young people that hasn't been said by everybody and his first cousin coming and going, by teachers and speakers, commencement speakers, counselors, leaders? What could I possibly say that has not been said to them? And then I came up with the idea, hey, let's go retro. Let's think about years past. Let me think about when I was a teenager, and believe it or not, I can still remember some things about when I was a teenager. Now, it's rather difficult because it's been 40 years, literally, since I qualified as a teenager. But I do remember some of the stuff I thought back then, my attitudes back then, the priorities of my life that I thought were very important back then. I still remember some of that. I also still remember how I looked back in those days. I want to share that with you this morning. Now, that's not a Halloween costume. That is me as a teenager. Now, obviously, a lot of things have changed. I can take that down immediately. Thank you. A lot of things have changed over the years, and we can be very, very grateful for that. But I began to think, if I was a teenager again, if I was a teenager in 2010, what would I say to these kids? And then I began to think about the Word of God. I thought about King Solomon. Not that I'm like him, because he was a very wise guy, and I wouldn't dare put myself on the same plane as King Solomon. But we know that he wrote 3 books in the Old Testament under the inspiration of God's Spirit. First of all, he wrote the Song of Solomon. He wrote that when he was a young man. And if you read the Song of Solomon, you'll understand what I'm talking about. It's a book all about eros. It's all about romantic love. And it's filled with all kinds of wonderful romantic imagery, the Song of Solomon. And Solomon wrote that when he was a young man. And then he also wrote the book of Proverbs. He wrote that in middle age, about 40, 50 years of age. He wrote that book, and basically it's a book of wisdom. And then later on in life, he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. That's where that verse was found that Natalie read just a little bit earlier about remember the Creator in the days of your youth. And I believe at that time, Solomon was looking back. He had gone retro. He was thinking about, if I could be a teenager again, what would I share with a new generation? What would I share with a younger generation? And he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And so basically he was doing the same thing that I'm doing this morning, if I could be a teenager again. And I want to share 3 things with you this morning that came out of my thought process as I contemplated that. Now, first of all, if I could be a teenager again, I would pay more attention to where I came from. To where I came from. Now, as a teenager, probably these young people have thought, I wish I had come from some other place. I wish that I lived in some other state or perhaps even another nation somewhere around the world, or I wish that I came from some other family. I know I had those thoughts when I was a teenager. When I was growing up, when I was a teenager 40 years ago, I really longed in my heart to live in California. I thought all the cool people lived in California. They surfed all day long, they partied all night long, and they drove cool hot rods to high school every single day. And I thought, man, that's where I want to be. I want to live in California. I thought that was the coolest place anybody could live. I didn't realize there was a whole lot more to life than just that. And I hate to admit it, but when I was growing up, there were times when I was a little embarrassed to be seen around my parents. Now, it's not that I didn't love them, because I've always loved my mom and dad. I've had the greatest mom and dad that anybody could ask for. I still love them to this very day. Nobody could ever take their place, so it's not a question about loving them. But I was a little embarrassed to be seen around them because it just seemed like they weren't with it. They weren't up to times. They were kind of behind times. They were kind of out of the loop. They really didn't know what was going on. I felt a little bit sorry for them, and I really didn't want to be seen with them. And many times I'd walk way behind them or way in front of them or way off to the side of them because I didn't want to be seen with them. Now, I've got to tell you, young people, if you're doing that, there's going to come a day of payback. There will be a day of payback. My son Andrew, I took him to school every day, and when he was in the 5th or 6th grade, he said, "Dad, why don't you let me out here before we get up to the circle drive in front of the school? Why don't you just let me out here?" And I said, "Well, son, we're a half a mile from the school. Why should I let you out here?" And he said, "Well, Dad, you said I need exercise, so let me out here a half a mile away." And then it dawned on me, it wasn't that he wanted exercise. It wasn't that he needed exercise. He was embarrassed to be seen with me, his father. And he wanted to be let out a half a mile away from the front entrance of the school so that nobody would see that he belonged to me and that I was his gene pool. He didn't want anybody to know that. Let me out a half a mile away. And I thought to myself immediately on that occasion, Lord, it's all fair because this is payback. It's payback because I felt the same way about my parents. Now, I kind of give you just a word of advice. If you're a teenager or whatever age you are, can I just give you a little word of advice from a teenager of the past? Be glad that you've got a family, because a lot of people don't in this generation. And be thankful that you're from somewhere, especially a place as wonderful as North Carolina, as wonderful as Charlotte and Weddington and this area. Just be grateful. Think about it like this. Who chose that family where you were born? That family that you live in. Who chose that family for you, and who chose you for the family? I believe that God did. And God had His purposes in doing that. He chose that particular family at this particular time for you, and He chose you in particular to be a part of that family. It didn't have to work out that way. You didn't choose that. You didn't say, God, I think I'll choose that family, and I think I'll be choosing to be born here in this generation. You didn't choose that. Neither did I. God, by His grace, in His sovereignty, placed us in the family where we are. He gave us to the family, and He gave the family to us. And also He placed us at this strategic time. You could have been born in the dark ages, or maybe during the formative years of this country, during the tough, turbulent American Revolution, or maybe during the deep, dark days of the Depression. But God allowed you to be born in this generation right now, and there's a reason for that. Remember what Mordecai said to his dear friend Esther, a relative to his family? He said, God has brought you to the kingdom for such an hour as this. And I would say to every young person here, to all of us who are seeking God's purpose in our lives, that God has brought us to the kingdom for such an hour as this. It's no accident. It's no incident. It's particularly the sovereign, providential will of God that we're here at this particular time. Now, if you come from a good, strong Christian family, they love you and they love the Lord, you ought to thank God every single day. I know it can be tough because Christian parents have rules and regulations. And when I was growing up, I didn't like rules and regulations either. But now that I look back on it, I know my parents had the right idea. And the reason they had those rules and regulations, the same reason God has rules and regulations, because He loves us. He's not trying to interfere with our fun or our pleasure. He's trying to make sure that we live long enough to really understand what life is about and to really enjoy life. And so if you come from a Christian family, you ought to be grateful and give God the glory every single day. Now, just because it's a Christian family doesn't mean you'll always be gung-ho about your family, nor does it mean that your family will always be perfect. Your family is not perfect. And you already realize that. You could probably name every imperfection in your family right now. Your family's not perfect, but I've got news for you. That's why you fit in so well over there, because you're not perfect either. You know what a family is? It's a whole bunch of imperfect people living in an imperfect world, trying to do their best to live life by the grace of God and for the glory of God. And there is no perfect family. There is no perfect teenager. There is no perfect youth. There is no perfect college student. We're all imperfect. That's why we fit in. And so if you come from a Christian family, you've got something to be grateful for this morning. Now, if you come from a dysfunctional family, and if you take Webster's dictionary and open it up and look up dysfunctional, there's a picture of your family right there beside that word dysfunctional. If you come from a family that's dysfunctional like that, I want to tell you, God still placed you in that family for a purpose. And God can use you in that family to shape and mold that family, to be an influence in that family, even as a young person. And God can help you to grow up strong in Him and mighty in Him, a mighty young man of God, a mighty young woman of God. Even in those circumstances, God can use you. I thought about some of the great biblical characters, and I wondered about their parents. For example, Judas Iscariot. Wonder about his mom and dad. We don't know much about them. We may know where they're from by the last name Iscariot. That's about all we know. We really don't know what they did for a living or what they raised their children to really be and to become. Do you think they were disappointed when little Judas grew up and turned out to be that he was? When he turned out to betray the Lord for 30 pieces of silver and he became solely responsible for Jesus Christ dying on the cross, do you think they were disappointed that he grew up and turned out that way? If they were disappointed, they're not the first parents to be disappointed, and they won't be the last. Many parents have gone through disappointment because they raised their children a certain way, and because they have their own will and their own volition, sometimes they make bad decisions and bad choices in life, and they turn out all wrong as in terms of what we thought they would be, and many times we're disappointed. And young people, I want to share this with you. You'll never fully understand that until you become a parent yourself. And when you become a parent yourself, then you'll understand the disappointment that sometimes children can bring to a parent's heart, and how often a parent's heart will be broken. And then I thought about Saul of Tarsus. Wonder about his mom and dad. Maybe they came from Tarsus. That's about all we know. Bible doesn't tell us much about them. Do you think they were proud of their son when Saul grew up and he hated the name of Jesus, and he sought to obliterate that name from the face of the earth, and then he turned out to die for that very name by dying as a martyr for the cause of Christ? Do you think they were proud of him? Do you think they felt glad that he turned out the way that he did? Do you think they were pleasantly surprised that he grew up and went through all those different stages he went through and then ended up being a great leader in the Christian church? When's the last time, young person, that you surprised your parents in a positive way by doing something they didn't expect from you, that they didn't foresee from you, and yet you did that, and because of that, you brought a smile to your parents' face? When's the last time you did something that really surprised them in a positive way? There's a second thing I want you to notice. If I was a teenager all over again, if I was a teenager, I would pay more attention to where I came from, but also I'd pay more attention to this concept, who I am. Who I am. As a teenager, do you ever feel like everybody's got a game plan for your life? I mean, your parents have one game plan, your teacher has a game plan, your counselors have a game plan, your preacher has a game plan, your deacon has a game plan, everybody's got a game plan. Even your peers, your same age, have a plan for your life, and they seem to have some idea this is what you ought to be and this is what you ought to do. And everybody seems to have all these ideas about you. And sometimes you can feel like everybody's trying to press you into a mold that you don't feel comfortable